Maria Rodriguez wiped down the stainless steel serving counter for the third time that morning, her weathered hands moving with a precision that nobody at Lincoln High School had ever bothered to notice. At 48, she had perfected the art of invisibility, blending into the background noise of teenage chatter and cafeteria chaos like steam disappearing into air. Her graying black hair was always pulled back in a neat bun beneath the mandatory hairnet, and her uniform of navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants hung loose on her compact frame, deliberately concealing the lean muscle that lay beneath. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The students who passed through her lunch line saw exactly what they expected to see. Another middle-aged immigrant woman ladling out mystery meat and overcooked vegetables for minimum wage. They never looked her in the eyes long enough to notice the sharp intelligence that lived there, or the way she unconsciously scanned every entrance and exit whenever she entered a room. They certainly never suspected that the quiet woman who served their chicken nuggets had once eliminated 3 armed insurgents in a Damascus safehouse using nothing but a dinner fork and 17 seconds of brutal efficiency. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when the right pressure is applied. And on this particular October morning, as Maria arranged the lunch trays with mathematical precision, she had no idea that her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with her buried past in the most public way possible. The collision would start with a 17-year-old bully named Derek Harrison, escalate through a series of events that would be captured on dozens of smartphone cameras, and end with the exposure of a military conspiracy that reached all the way to the Pentagon. What Maria also didn't know was that across town, in a glass office overlooking Riverside's business district, Derek's father, Richard Harrison, was at that very moment ending a phone call that would change everything. The call was from a private military contractor who had just identified a face in a social media video from Lincoln High School, a face that belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead. The morning rush at Lincoln High School's cafeteria was a carefully orchestrated symphony of controlled chaos, and Maria Rodriguez conducted it from her position behind the serving line with the same tactical awareness that had once kept her alive in some of the world's most dangerous places. She arrived each day at 5:30 in the morning, 2 hours before the first student would set foot on campus, using the quiet time to prepare not just the food but her environment. Most people assumed she came early because she was dedicated to her job, which was partially true. What they didn't realize was that those pre-dawn hours allowed her to conduct what she privately called her morning reconnaissance. She would walk through every corridor, noting which exit doors had been left unlocked overnight, checking sight lines through windows, and memorizing the positions of security cameras. Old habits from her Navy days died hard, and in her experience, preparation was the difference between coming home and being shipped home in a box. Lincoln High School was a sprawling complex that housed 1,200 students from Riverside's increasingly diverse population. Built in the 1980s and renovated twice since then, it had the institutional feel of beige walls and fluorescent lighting that seemed designed to drain the life out of anyone who spent too much time inside. The cafeteria itself was a cavernous space that could seat 400 students, with floor-to-ceiling windows along the eastern wall that provided excellent natural lighting during the lunch periods. Maria had chosen this job specifically because of the cafeteria's layout. The kitchen area where she worked provided multiple exit routes, direct access to potential improvised weapons, and clear sight lines to monitor the entire dining area. It also gave her the perfect cover for her real purpose in Riverside: gathering intelligence on Richard Harrison, the defense contractor whose decisions had cost the lives of her entire SEAL team 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her that Harrison's son Derek was one of her regular customers, though the boy had no idea that the woman serving his lunch had been hunting his father with the patience of a professional predator. Derek Harrison was 17 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and carried himself with the arrogant confidence that came from being the star quarterback of a winning football team and the son of one of Riverside's wealthiest residents. His father's money had bought him the kind of popularity that allowed him to treat teachers with casual disrespect and fellow students as either allies or obstacles to be crushed. Maria had been observing Derek for 3 years, watching as he evolved from a merely entitled freshman into something darker and more dangerous. He had gathered around himself a crew of like-minded individuals who used their social status and physical size to maintain a reign of terror over Lincoln's more vulnerable students. His inner circle consisted of Jake Peterson, a linebacker whose solution to every problem involved his fists, Tyler Brooks, whose wealthy family owned half the strip malls in Riverside County, and Madison Clark, whose social media following gave her the power to destroy reputations with a single post. Together, they had created an ecosystem of fear that the school's administration either couldn't or wouldn't address. Principal Robert Chun was a well-meaning man in his 50s who genuinely cared about education, but he came from a generation that believed teenage bullying was a normal part of growing up. Head coach Mike Thompson actively protected his star players from consequences, viewing their aggressive behavior as evidence of the competitive spirit that won football games. The result was an environment where students like Emma Martinez lived in constant fear. Emma was 14 years old, a freshman who had made the mistake of being both academically gifted and economically disadvantaged. She was the kind of student who ate lunch alone while reading library books, who raised her hand in class even when she knew it would earn her mockery from the popular kids. Her mother worked double shifts at a local factory to keep their small apartment, which meant Emma often stayed after school in the library until the building closed, avoiding the empty house that reminded her how alone she really was. Maria had been watching Emma too, recognizing something of her younger self in the girl's determination to rise above her circumstances through sheer force of will. In her previous life as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, she had been the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to pay for her daughter's education. The military had been her escape route from poverty, just as education was Emma's chosen path to a better future. The cafeteria operated on a rigid schedule that Maria had memorized down to the minute. The first lunch period began at 11:15, with the freshman and sophomore classes, followed by juniors and seniors at 12:15. Emma always arrived early, getting her lunch quickly and finding a table near the windows where she could read while eating. Derek and his crew typically arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that allowed them to survey the room and select their targets for entertainment. Maria's official duties were straightforward: serve food, maintain hygiene standards, and assist with crowd control during the lunch periods. What she actually did was far more complex. She had spent 3 years mapping the social dynamics of Lincoln High School with the same attention to detail she had once applied to analyzing terrorist networks in the Middle East. She knew which students were natural leaders, which ones were followers, and which ones were vulnerable to exploitation. She understood the communication patterns, the power structures, and the unspoken rules that governed teenage behavior. She also knew that Derek Harrison was escalating. Over the past month, his treatment of other students had become more aggressive, more personal, and more public. He seemed to be building towards something, though Maria wasn't yet sure what. Her years of experience reading hostile environments told her that the current equilibrium was unstable, that pressure was building toward some kind of release. She just hadn't expected that release to come during the 3rd week of October, or that it would force her to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting an innocent girl. The morning of October 18th began like any other. Maria arrived at 5:30, conducted her security sweep, and began the methodical process of preparing lunch for 1,200 teenagers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She worked alongside two other cafeteria staff members, Mrs. Patricia Williams, a 60-year-old grandmother who had been serving school lunches for 15 years, and Carlos Mendez, a recent culinary school graduate who treated the industrial kitchen like it was a training ground for future restaurant work. Neither of them suspected that their quiet colleague had once been part of the most elite military unit in the world. They saw her efficiency in the kitchen, her calm demeanor during the lunch rush, and her ability to diffuse tense situations with troublemaking students, but they attributed these skills to experience and natural temperament rather than years of training in high-stress combat environments. As the morning progressed, Maria noticed several things that elevated her alert status. Officer James Wilson, the school security guard and a former Marine, seemed more tense than usual during his morning rounds. Principal Chun had received multiple phone calls that left him looking worried. Most significantly, Derek Harrison had arrived at school that morning with a different energy, the kind of agitated confidence that Maria had learned to recognize as a prelude to violence. By 11 o'clock, as she began setting up the serving line for the first lunch period, Maria's instincts were telling her that today was going to be different. She adjusted her position behind the counter to improve her sight lines to the dining area, mentally reviewed the locations of potential weapons within reach, and prepared herself for whatever was coming. She didn't have to wait long. At 11:20, 5 minutes after the lunch period had officially begun, Emma Martinez entered the cafeteria with her usual armload of textbooks and her worn backpack slung over one shoulder. She moved through the lunch line quickly, selecting a small salad and a carton of milk, paying with the careful precision of someone who had counted every dollar. Maria served her with a slight nod of acknowledgement, the same minimal interaction. They had shared every school day for 3 years. Emma found her usual table near the windows and settled in with her lunch and a paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that was required reading for her English class. For 15 minutes, she ate and read in peaceful solitude, unaware that she was about to become the catalyst for events that would change everything. At 11:30-5, Derek Harrison and his crew made their entrance. Derek Harrison swept into the cafeteria like a conquering general surveying his domain, his letterman jacket draped casually over his shoulders and his blonde hair styled with the kind of expensive product that cost more than most students' weekly allowances. At 17, he had already perfected the art of commanding attention without appearing to try, moving with the fluid confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. His pale blue eyes scanned the dining area with predatory interest, cataloging potential targets and assessing the mood of his audience. Jake Peterson flanked him on the left, a mountain of muscle who had been Derek's enforcer since middle school. Standing 6'4" and weighing 230 pounds, Jake was the kind of athlete who solved problems through intimidation and physical dominance. His thick neck bore the marks of countless football collisions, and his hands were perpetually swollen from punching various objects when his temper got the better of him. Unlike Derek, who preferred psychological warfare, Jake's approach to maintaining their social hierarchy was refreshingly direct. Tyler Brooks took position on Derek's right, carrying himself with the entitled swagger that came from being born into old Riverside money. His family's wealth was quieter than the Harrison fortune, but ran deeper, stretching back 3 generations of successful business ventures and political connections. Tyler had learned early that money could solve most problems and create opportunities that others could only dream about. His role in the group was financial logistics, ensuring they always had resources for their schemes and access to venues where ordinary students were unwelcome. Madison Clark completed their inner circle, though she maintained the illusion of independence that allowed her to gather intelligence from students who might be wary of direct association with Derek's crew. At 16, she had already mastered the complex social dynamics of modern teenage hierarchies, understanding instinctively how to weaponize social media and peer pressure to destroy anyone who challenged their authority. Her phone was constantly in her hand, documenting everything for her various social media accounts, where she commanded an audience of thousands. Together, they represented the apex of Lincoln High School's food chain, a carefully constructed alliance of athletic prowess, financial resources, social influence, and technological reach. They had spent years perfecting their system of control, identifying vulnerable students and crushing any potential challenges to their dominance before they could gain momentum. The administration either couldn't or wouldn't stop them. Teachers were intimidated by their family connections, and other students had learned that resistance only made the consequences more severe. Derek's father, Richard Harrison, had built his fortune through Harrison Defense Solutions, a private military contracting firm that specialized in providing security services and logistical support for overseas operations. The company's rapid growth over the past decade had made the family wealthy beyond most people's comprehension, but it had also created expectations for Derek that went far beyond typical teenage responsibilities. Richard expected his son to demonstrate leadership, dominance, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that had built their empire. These expectations had shaped Derek into something far more dangerous than a typical high school bully. He approached his social dominance with the same strategic thinking that his father applied to military contracts, identifying objectives, analyzing opposition, and executing plans with calculated precision. The difference was that Derek's battlefield was a suburban high school, and his enemies were vulnerable teenagers who had no understanding of the forces arrayed against them. Jake Peterson's loyalty to Derek stemmed from a mixture of genuine friendship and calculated self-interest. His own family background was solidly middle class. His father was a mechanic and his mother worked part-time at a local grocery store, but his association with Derek provided access to opportunities that would otherwise be impossible. College recruiters who might overlook his mediocre grades were suddenly interested when they learned about his connections to the Harrison family fortune. Social events that would normally be off-limits became accessible through Derek's influence. More importantly, Jake genuinely enjoyed the power that came with being Derek's enforcer. He had discovered early in life that his size and strength could be used to intimidate others, and high school had provided the perfect environment to refine these skills. Teachers were reluctant to challenge him because of his importance to the football team. Students gave him a wide berth out of fear, and the administration treated him with the special consideration reserved for athletes who brought glory to the school. Tyler Brooks represented old money sophistication in contrast to the nouveau rich energy of the Harrison family. His great-grandfather had founded Brooks Construction during the post-war boom, building subdivisions and shopping centers throughout Southern California. His grandfather had diversified into real estate development, and his father had expanded into political consulting and municipal contracts. The Brooks family name appeared on park benches, library wings, and scholarship funds throughout Riverside County. This background had given Tyler a more nuanced understanding of power than his companions possessed. While Derek relied on direct confrontation and Jake used physical intimidation, Tyler preferred to operate through systems and institutions. He understood how to leverage family connections to influence grades, disciplinary actions, and college admissions. His weapons were phone calls to school board members, donations to athletic programs, and the kind of quiet pressure that left no fingerprints but achieved devastating results. Madison Clark's role in the group was perhaps the most sophisticated, requiring her to maintain relationships across multiple social circles while gathering intelligence and shaping narratives through her social media presence. She had cultivated an image as an independent influencer who happened to be friends with popular students, rather than a deliberate participant in systematic bullying. This positioning allowed her to befriend potential victims, gain their trust, and then weaponize their confidences against them when the time was right. Her Instagram account had 43,000 followers. Her TikTok videos regularly received hundreds of thousands of views, and her Snapchat stories provided real-time documentation of student life at Lincoln High School. What her audience didn't understand was how carefully curated this content was, how every post served strategic purposes beyond entertainment. She could destroy reputations with a single unflattering photo, elevate or diminish social status through selective inclusion in her content, and coordinate harassment campaigns that appeared organic but were actually precisely orchestrated. The group's arrival in the cafeteria followed a ritual that had been refined over years of practice. Derek would survey the room, identifying targets and gauging the energy of potential witnesses. Jake would position himself to block exit routes and discourage intervention from other students. Tyler would ensure they had sufficient space and privacy for whatever they planned to do. Madison would begin recording, capturing footage that could be edited and distributed to maximize impact. Their usual targets were students who stood out in some way, academic achievers who made others feel inadequate, athletes from rival teams, anyone whose family circumstances made them vulnerable to financial pressure, or simply individuals who had committed the crime of being different in an environment that demanded conformity. They had developed a sophisticated understanding of teenage psychology, knowing exactly which pressure points would cause maximum emotional damage while remaining just barely within the boundaries of plausible deniability. Emma Martinez had been on their radar since freshman orientation, when her academic achievements had been announced during the welcome assembly. A scholarship student with a perfect attendance record and straight A grades, she represented everything that Derek's group found threatening: intelligent, hardworking, and completely unimpressed by their social status. Her poverty made her vulnerable to certain types of pressure, but her moral convictions made her resistant to corruption or compromise. More importantly, Emma had begun to attract positive attention from teachers and administrators who held her up as an example of what students could achieve through dedication and hard work. This kind of recognition represented a direct challenge to the narrative that Derek's group had worked years to establish, that success at Lincoln High School required either athletic talent, family connections, or social media popularity. Emma's existence proved that academic achievement alone could earn respect and opportunities, which undermined their entire power structure. Derek had been planning Emma's destruction since the beginning of the school year, waiting for the right moment and the right audience to make his move. He wanted her humiliation to be public and complete, serving as a warning to other students who might be tempted to challenge the established hierarchy through academic achievement or moral courage. As the group settled into their usual table, near the center of the cafeteria, Derek's attention focused on Emma's solitary figure by the windows. She was completely absorbed in her book, unconsciously presenting the perfect target for what he had planned. Her isolation meant there would be no friends to intervene. Her focus on reading meant she wouldn't see them coming until it was too late, and her position near the windows provided excellent lighting for the video footage that Madison would capture. What none of them realized was that their every movement was being observed by someone whose training in threat assessment far exceeded anything they could imagine. Maria Rodriguez had identified them as a potential problem the moment they entered the cafeteria, and she was already calculating angles, distances, and response times for various scenarios that might unfold. The transformation in Derek's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to anyone trained in reading predatory behavior. His casual swagger shifted into something more focused and purposeful as he locked onto Emma Martinez like a missile acquiring its target. Maria watched from behind the serving counter as Derek whispered something to his companions that made Jake grinned with anticipation and caused Tyler to glance around the cafeteria with calculating eyes. Madison had already pulled out her phone, ostensibly checking messages but actually switching to video mode in preparation for what was about to unfold. Emma remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm, her attention completely absorbed by Harper Lee's masterful exploration of justice and moral courage in Depression-era Alabama. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that the girl was reading about standing up to bullies at the exact moment when she was about to become the victim of a very modern form of persecution. The book lay open beside her small salad, and she took occasional bites while turning pages, her face reflecting the concentration of someone who found genuine escape in literature. Derek rose from his table with theatrical casualness, stretching his arms above his head and yawning as if he had just noticed Emma's presence across the room. His performance was designed to make their approach appear spontaneous rather than premeditated, maintaining the fiction that whatever happened next was simply boys being boys rather than a calculated assault on a vulnerable student. Jake and Tyler followed his lead, standing and stretching as if they were simply restless teenagers looking for entertainment. The cafeteria's ambient noise level provided perfect cover for their movement. Conversations echoed off the hard surfaces of institutional furniture and tiled floors, creating a constant buzz that would mask their approach until they were close enough to spring their trap. Other students were absorbed in their own social dramas, eating their lunches and gossiping about weekend plans, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would change everything. Maria's hands continued their automatic motions of wiping down surfaces and organizing supplies, but her peripheral vision tracked every step of Derek's advance toward Emma's table. Her training in close protection had taught her to identify threat patterns long before they reached the action phase, and everything about Derek's body language screamed hostile intent. The way he moved his shoulders, the slight forward lean of his posture, the predatory focus in his eyes, all indicators that violence was not just possible, but inevitable. She found herself calculating distances and response times with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent years in environments where such calculations meant the difference between life and death. Emma's table was approximately 40 feet from the serving counter, which meant Maria could cover that distance in roughly 3 seconds if she moved at full speed. Derek's group was currently 20 feet from Emma and closing at a leisurely pace that would put them at her table in approximately 15 seconds. The timing would be critical. Move too early, and she would reveal capabilities that were supposed to remain hidden. Move too late, and Emma would suffer trauma that could affect her for years to come. Maria had seen what systematic bullying could do to young people, how it could destroy self-confidence and derail promising futures. She had also seen what happened when predators were allowed to operate without consequences, how they escalated their behavior until someone eventually got seriously hurt. Derek reached Emma's table first, sliding into the seat across from her with a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. The movement was smooth and practiced, designed to appear casual while actually trapping Emma between himself and the window. She looked up from her book with surprise and obvious discomfort, recognizing Derek but unsure why he would want to sit with her. "Hey there, Emma," Derek said, his voice carrying the false warmth that predators used to disarm their victims. "Great book. I love the classics. Really makes you think about justice and doing the right thing, doesn't it?" Emma's response was cautious but polite, the ingrained courtesy of someone who had been raised to respect others, even when they made her uncomfortable. "It's for English class. Mrs. Patterson assigned it for our unit on social justice literature." "Social justice," Derek repeated, his tone shifting slightly toward mockery. "That's perfect. Because I think there's some injustice happening right here in our cafeteria that we need to address." Jake and Tyler had positioned themselves on either side of Emma's table, effectively boxing her in and creating a wall of hostile male energy that would intimidate anyone, let alone a 14-year-old girl eating lunch alone. Madison had found a position about 10 feet away where she could capture everything on video, while maintaining the pretense that she was simply documenting typical cafeteria social interactions for her followers. Emma's discomfort was becoming more obvious as she realized this wasn't a friendly social visit. She closed her book and started gathering her things, clearly hoping to escape whatever was developing. But Derek's next words stopped her cold. "See, the thing is, Emma, some of us have been talking, and we think there's been a misunderstanding about how things work around here, about who deserves recognition and who doesn't, about what really matters in the real world versus what happens in textbooks." The menace in his voice was becoming more apparent, though he maintained the same conversational tone he might use to discuss weekend plans. Emma's eyes darted toward the exits, but Jake and Tyler's positioning made it clear that leaving wouldn't be simple. Other students in the immediate area were beginning to notice the confrontation, some pulling out their own phones to record what was clearly developing into a dramatic incident. "I don't understand what you mean," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "I'm just trying to eat lunch and do my homework." "That's exactly the problem," Derek continued, leaning forward across the table in favor, a gesture that appeared friendly but was actually deeply threatening. "You're always doing homework, always studying, always making the rest of us look bad with your perfect grades and your perfect attendance and your perfect little scholarship. Student routine." Tyler picked up the thread seamlessly, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that came from years of never facing consequences for his words. "Some people think that just because they get good grades, they're better than everyone else. Like they deserve special treatment or something." Jake's contribution was more direct, his massive frame leaning over Emma's table in a display of physical intimidation that made his intentions crystal clear. "Maybe it's time someone explained how the real world works around here." Emma's response showed the kind of quiet courage that Maria recognized from her own younger self. Despite being outnumbered, cornered, and clearly terrified, she looked Derek directly in the eyes and spoke with steady determination. "I've never said I was better than anyone. I just work hard because I want to go to college. I don't have the advantages that some people have, so I have to earn everything through my grades." The reference to advantages hit its target perfectly, and Derek's friendly mask finally slipped completely. His blue eyes hardened into something cold and calculating, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of venom that Maria had heard in interrogation rooms and combat zones. "Advantages? You think we don't work for what we have? You think everything was just handed to us because our families are successful? Maybe it's time you learned some respect for people who actually matter in this community." Madison stepped closer, her phone now openly recording as she sensed the moment approaching when Derek would escalate from psychological intimidation to something more dramatic. The gathering crowd of student witnesses was growing larger, drawn by the unmistakable energy of conflict and the social media potential of whatever was about to happen. Emma's voice remained steady, but Maria could see the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped her book tighter. "I respect everyone. I've never done anything to any of you. I just want to be left alone to eat my lunch. That's the problem." "Right there," Derek said, his voice rising just enough to ensure that nearby students could hear every word. "You think you can just ignore the social order around here? You think you can be some kind of special case who doesn't have to pay attention to how things really work?" Tyler's laugh was harsh and deliberately loud, designed to humiliate Emma in front of the growing audience. Maybe she needs a lesson in social studies. Real social studies, not the kind they teach in books. Jake cracked his knuckles with obvious menace, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet section of the cafeteria where their confrontation was unfolding. "I think she needs to learn some manners. like saying please and thank you when people try to help her understand her place. The threat was now explicit and unmistakable. Emma was trapped, outnumbered, and facing escalating aggression from three physically intimidating individuals while being recorded by a fourth. Other students were watching but making no move to intervene, understanding instinctively that challenging Derek's group would make them targets as well, from her position. Behind the serving counter, Maria had seen enough. The situation had escalated beyond verbal intimidation and was clearly heading toward physical confrontation or complete psychological destruction of a vulnerable student. Her cover identity as a quiet cafeteria worker demanded that she remain uninvolved, letting the drama play out while maintaining her invisibility. But Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had taken an oath to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that oath didn't disappear just because she was hiding behind an assumed name and serving lunch to teenagers. The time for invisibility was about to end. Emma Martinez made a decision that would change everything. Instead of submitting to Derek's intimidation or attempting to flee, she stood up slowly and looked him directly in the eyes with the kind of quiet defiance that Maria recognized from her own military training. It was the look of someone who had decided that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. "You know what?" Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed section of the cafeteria. "I do understand how things work around here. You think because your families have money and connections, you can treat other people however you want. You think because you're bigger and stronger, everyone else should be afraid of you." Derek's expression shifted from surprise to anger to something much more dangerous. He hadn't expected resistance, certainly not articulate resistance that highlighted exactly what he was doing in front of an audience that was growing larger by the minute. Madison's phone captured every word, and other students were pulling out their own devices to record what was clearly becoming a defining moment in Lincoln High School's social hierarchy. "But you're wrong about one thing," Emma continued, gathering her books against her chest like a shield while maintaining eye contact with her tormentors. "I'm not afraid of you. My mom works 2 jobs to keep us in our apartment, and she taught me that self-respect isn't something anyone can take away from you unless you let them. So no, I won't apologize for getting good grades. I won't pretend to be something I'm not. And I won't let you make me feel ashamed for trying to build a better future." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Derek's face had flushed red with anger and embarrassment, and Maria could see the exact moment when he made the decision to escalate the situation beyond words. His body language shifted into a more aggressive posture, his hands clenched into fists, and his voice dropped to the low, menacing tone that had intimidated countless other students into submission. "You think you're brave?" Derek said, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You think standing up to us makes you some kind of hero? Let me show you what happens to people who don't know their place." Jake and Tyler immediately flanked him, their combined mass creating a wall of intimidation that would have terrified most adults, let alone a 90-pound freshman girl. The implied threat of violence was unmistakable, and several students in the surrounding area began backing away, sensing that the situation was about to turn genuinely dangerous. Emma took a step backward, her brave facade beginning to crack as the reality of her situation became fully apparent. She was outnumbered 3-1 by much larger, older students who clearly had no intention of backing down. Her moral courage was admirable, but it wouldn't protect her from the physical confrontation that Derek was obviously preparing to initiate. "Please," she said quietly, her voice finally showing the fear that she had been fighting to suppress. "I just want to finish my lunch and go to class. I don't want any trouble." Derek's smile was predatory and cold, the expression of someone who had finally cornered his prey and was savoring the moment before the final strike. "Oh, it's too late for that now. You already made your choice when you decided to lecture us about respect and self-worth. Now you get to learn what happens when scholarship kids forget who really runs this school. Tyler pulled out his own phone, apparently deciding that Madison shouldn't be the only one documenting Emma's humiliation for social media. "This is going to be epic," he said loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "Finally someone's going to put little Miss Perfect in her place." Jake stepped closer to Emma, his massive frame casting a shadow over her table as he leaned down to bring his face level with hers. "Here's how this works," he said, his voice a low growl that carried clear threats of physical violence. "You're going to apologize to Derek for disrespecting him. Then you're going to admit that you think you're better than everyone else because of your grades. Then you're going to promise to stay in your lane and stop making the rest of us look bad." Emma's response was barely a whisper, but her words carried across the silent cafeteria with perfect clarity. "No." The single syllable hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, challenging not just Derek and his crew but the entire social order that they represented. Other students stared in shock and admiration at the 90-pound girl who was refusing to submit to intimidation that would have broken much stronger people. Derek's reaction was immediate and violent. He slammed his palm down on Emma's table with enough force to make her lunch tray jump and her milk carton tip over, sending white liquid spreading across her books and papers. The sound echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot, and several students gasped or cried out in surprise. "Wrong answer," Derek snarled, his carefully maintained facade of civility finally cracking completely. "Since you want to be stubborn about this, we'll have to find other ways to help you understand your situation." Tyler reached across the table and knocked Emma's book to the floor, grinding it under his expensive sneaker while maintaining eye contact with her terrified face. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "Looks like your precious book got damaged. That's going to cost money to replace, isn't it? Money your family doesn't have." Jake picked up Emma's lunch tray and held it above his head, clearly preparing to dump the remaining contents on her while Madison positioned herself to capture the perfect angle for maximum social media impact. The threat was clear. They were going to humiliate her completely, destroy her property, and ensure that the footage of her degradation would follow her for the rest of her high school career. Emma closed her eyes and braced herself for what was coming, her small frame tensing as she prepared to endure whatever they planned to do to her. The surrounding students watched in horrified fascination, some recording on their phones, others looking away in shame at their own inability to intervene. That was when Maria Rodriguez decided that her cover was less important than protecting an innocent girl from systematic brutalization. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment she was a quiet middle-aged cafeteria worker, wiping down serving counters 40 feet away. The next moment she was moving with fluid, predatory grace that covered the distance to Emma's table in less than 3 seconds. Her approach was so silent and purposeful that none of Derek's group noticed her until she was already within striking distance. "Excuse me," Maria said politely, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made everyone in the immediate area freeze in place. "Is there a problem here?" Derek turned toward her with the irritated expression of someone being interrupted during an important task. "This doesn't concern you, lady. Go back to serving food and mind your own business." Maria's response was delivered in the same polite, professional tone she used when asking students if they wanted extra vegetables with their lunch. "Actually, preventing students from being assaulted in my cafeteria is very much my business. I'm going to have to ask you to return to your table and leave this young lady alone." Tyler laughed with genuine amusement at what he perceived as a pathetic attempt at intervention by someone with no authority or ability to back up her words. "What are you going to do about it? Call security? Report us to the principal?" "We're not breaking any rules, just having a conversation with a fellow student." Jake still held Emma's lunch tray above his head, and his grin was savage as he looked down at Maria's compact frame. "Yeah, cafeteria lady. Why don't you go back to ladling out slop and let us handle student affairs?" Madison had shifted her phone's focus to capture this new development, sensing that the addition of an adult attempting to intervene would make the footage even more dramatic and shareable. "This is perfect," she whispered to herself, already composing the social media posts that would accompany the video. Maria's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her posture that anyone with combat experience would have recognized as preparation for violence. Her weight settled more evenly on the balls of her feet. Her hands moved to a position where they could react instantly to threats, and her eyes began tracking multiple targets simultaneously. "Last chance," she said quietly, her voice still polite but carrying an undertone that made the hair on the back of several students' necks stand up. "Step away from the table, return to your seats, and we can all pretend this never happened." Derek's response sealed the fate of everyone involved. Instead of recognizing the warning signs that a trained observer would have noticed, he saw only a middle-aged immigrant woman who was trying to interfere with something that was none of her business. "Make me," he said, stepping closer to Maria with the same aggressive posture he had used to intimidate Emma. "What's a lunch lady going to do to stop us?" Maria's smile was gentle and almost maternal as she reached for the metal serving spoon. Clipped to her apron. "Let me show you," she said. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed frame by military experts, and studied in tactical training facilities around the world. But in the moment, it appeared to most observers like a series of unfortunate accidents that befell Derek Harrison and his crew in rapid succession. Maria's movement with the serving spoon was so fluid and natural that it looked like she was simply reaching for a piece of cafeteria equipment that had been left out of place. The casual observer might have thought she was going to clean something, or perhaps threaten Derek with a kitchen utensil in the way that an angry grandmother might brandish a wooden spoon. What actually happened was a textbook example of improvised weapons deployment executed with the kind of precision that could only come from years of training in close-quarters combat. The serving spoon connected with a nerve cluster in Derek's right shoulder with surgical accuracy, causing his entire arm to go numb and dropping him to his knees with a grunt of pain and surprise. To the students watching, it looked like Maria had simply bumped into him with her cleaning equipment, and he had somehow lost his balance. The reality was that she had temporarily paralyzed his dominant arm using a technique that Navy SEALs learned for subduing enemies silently. Jake's reaction was predictably aggressive and completely ineffective. Still holding Emma's lunch tray above his head, he tried to bring it down on Maria's head in a move that would have seriously injured anyone else. But Maria was no longer where his brain expected her to be. She had shifted position with the kind of fluid movement that made it appear as though Jake had simply missed his target due to his own clumsiness. The lunch tray sailed harmlessly through empty air and crashed into Tyler Brooks, who had been moving to flank Maria from the left. The impact sent Tyler stumbling backward into another table, where he knocked over multiple students' lunches and landed in a heap of scattered food and overturned chairs. To the casual observer, it looked like Jake's own momentum had caused him to accidentally assault his friend. Meanwhile, Jake's follow-through from his missed attack left him off balance and vulnerable. Maria helped him continue his forward momentum with what appeared to be a steadying hand on his back, but was actually a precisely applied pressure that sent him stumbling forward into the serving line, where he crashed into a cart full of dirty lunch trays with a tremendous clatter of metal and plastic. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds, and to most of the students watching, it looked like Derek's crew had somehow managed to injure themselves and each other, while the quiet cafeteria worker had simply tried to stay out of their way. The only indication that Maria had been involved at all was her position standing calmly beside Emma's table, straightening her hairnet as if the chaos around her was simply an inconvenience. Madison Clark stood frozen with her phone in her hand, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Her followers expected drama and conflict, but this was something else entirely. The footage she had captured showed Derek dropping to his knees for no apparent reason, Jake somehow missing, a simple attack and knocking down his own friend, and Tyler becoming entangled in furniture through what appeared to be his own lack of coordination. Derek struggled to his feet, his right arm still hanging uselessly at his side as he tried to understand what had happened to him. The pain in his shoulder was intense and unlike anything he had experienced before, shooting down his arm in waves. That made his fingers tingle and his hand feel disconnected from his body. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, his voice tight with pain and confusion. Maria's expression was one of innocent concern, like a grandmother worried about a grandchild who had taken a tumble. "Oh my, did you hurt yourself, sweetheart? These cafeteria floors can be slippery sometimes. Maybe you should sit down until the feeling comes back to your arm." The suggestion that Derek had injured himself through his own clumsiness was infuriating. But he couldn't articulate exactly what Maria had done to him. To everyone watching, including the security cameras that recorded every corner of the cafeteria, it looked like he had simply fallen down while trying to intimidate a student. Jake had extracted himself from the cart of dirty trays and was advancing on Maria with murder in his eyes. His football training had taught him to respond to obstacles with overwhelming force, and he clearly intended to tackle the slight woman who had somehow caused his humiliating crash into the serving line. "You crazy old witch," he snarled, lowering his shoulder in preparation for a charge that would have sent most people to the hospital. "I'm going to crush you." Maria's response was to step slightly to the side while extending one foot in what appeared to be an attempt to maintain her balance. Jake's charge carried him past her and directly into the extended foot, which caught his ankle at exactly the right angle to send him tumbling face first into a table full of freshman students. The impact scattered food, drinks, and students in all directions, creating a scene of absolute chaos that looked like the result of Jake's own aggressive momentum rather than any defensive action by Maria. The freshman girls at the table screamed and scattered, covered in various lunch items and looking like victims of Jake's uncontrolled aggression. Tyler had finally untangled himself from the overturned chairs and was moving to rejoin the fight, but his approach was more cautious than his friend's direct assaults. He had noticed that somehow every attack on the cafeteria worker had resulted in disaster for the attacker, though he couldn't quite understand how or why. "This is insane," he muttered, pulling out his phone to call for backup. "Security needs to see this crazy woman before someone gets seriously hurt." Maria overheard his comment and turned toward him the same gentle smile she used when asking students if they wanted seconds on dessert. "Oh, that's a wonderful idea," she said brightly. "I think Officer Wilson should definitely see what's been happening here. In fact, let me help you with that call." She reached toward Tyler's phone as if offering to help him dial, but her movement somehow resulted in the device flying out of his hand and landing in a nearby trash can with a wet splash. Tyler stared in disbelief at the garbage receptacle that had somehow swallowed his $800 smartphone. "Oops," Maria said, with convincing sincerity. "How clumsy of me. I do hope that wasn't an expensive phone." By this point, the cafeteria had erupted into complete chaos. Students were pulling out their own phones to record the unfolding drama. Some were fleeing toward the exits to avoid becoming collateral damage, and others were gathering in groups to get better views of what was clearly the most exciting thing to happen at Lincoln High School in years. Emma Martinez remained at her table, staring in amazement at the transformation of the quiet woman who served her lunch every day. The Maria Rodriguez she thought she knew had been replaced by someone who moved with lethal grace and seemed capable of turning Derek's crew into a collection of bruised and humiliated teenagers without apparent effort. Derek was still struggling with his paralyzed arm, Jake was extracting himself from another pile of overturned furniture and scattered food, and Tyler was staring mournfully at the trash can that contained his phone. Madison continued recording, though she was beginning to suspect that the footage would raise more questions than it answered. "What are you?" Derek demanded, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching fear. "What kind of cafeteria worker moves like that?" Maria's response was delivered with the same friendly professionalism she used when explaining the day's menu options. "I'm just someone who believes students should be able to eat their lunch in peace without being bullied by insecure children who think family money makes them special." The insult hit its target perfectly, and Derek's face flushed with renewed anger despite his physical disadvantage. "You have no idea who you're messing with, lady. My father owns half this town. When he hears about this, you'll be lucky if you're not arrested for assault." Maria's laugh was genuinely amused, the sound of someone who had faced real threats and found teenage posturing slightly ridiculous by comparison. "Oh, sweetie, I'm not the one who's going to have trouble explaining this situation to their father. You might want to think about how you're going to justify why 3 big strong boys couldn't handle one middle-aged lunch lady without embarrassing themselves." The truth of her observation was undeniable. The security footage would show Derek's crew initiating aggression against both Emma and Maria, while Maria herself had never thrown a punch, wielded a weapon, or done anything that could be clearly identified as an attack. Yet somehow, Derek's arm was numb, Jake was covered in food and nursing multiple bruises, and Tyler was phoneless and demoralized. Officer James Wilson chose that moment to arrive, drawn by the commotion and the reports of a disturbance in the cafeteria. His trained eye took in the scene instantly. Overturned tables, scattered food, 3 disheveled male students, 1 calm cafeteria worker, and dozens of excited witnesses recording everything on their phones. Officer James Wilson stood in the doorway of the cafeteria like a man trying to process a crime scene that defied logical explanation. At 52 years old and 23 years removed from his service as a Marine Corps infantry sergeant, he had developed reliable instincts for reading chaotic situations and identifying the primary actors. What he saw before him challenged every assumption he might have made about a typical high school disturbance. Derek Harrison sat slumped in a chair, cradling his right arm against his chest while his face cycled through expressions of pain, confusion, and mounting rage. Jake Peterson was attempting to clean food debris from his Letterman jacket while sporting what appeared to be the beginning of a spectacular black eye. Tyler Brooks stood beside an overturned table, staring forlornly at a trash can as if it contained something precious that he would never recover. In stark contrast to the disheveled state of the 3 male students, Maria Rodriguez stood calmly beside Emma Martinez's table, straightening condiment dispensers and wiping down surfaces. With the methodical precision of someone completing routine maintenance tasks. Her uniform was spotless, her hairnet remained perfectly positioned, and her breathing showed no signs of recent exertion or stress. The disconnect between the obvious aftermath of some kind of physical altercation and Maria's serene composure set off warning bells in Wilson's trained mind. His years of military experience had taught him to recognize the aftermath of violence, and something about this scene didn't match the typical pattern of cafeteria fights or student conflicts. "Someone want to explain what happened here?" Wilson asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers in tense situations. Derek was the first to respond, his words tumbling out in an angry rush that betrayed both pain and humiliation. "That woman attacked us. We were just talking to Emma at a school project, and she came over and assaulted me with some kind of weapon. Look at my arm, I can barely move it." Wilson's gaze shifted to Maria, who was now organizing plastic utensils in a nearby dispenser with the focused attention of someone completing an important task. "Ma'am, did you strike this student?" Maria looked up with the expression of mild surprise that might appear on someone's face when asked about events they had barely noticed. Strike him? Oh goodness no, Officer Wilson. I was just cleaning up around Emma's table when these boys started having some kind of accident. Derek here seemed to hurt his shoulder somehow, and then his friends started bumping into things. I tried to stay out of their way, but you know how clumsy teenagers can be when they get excited. Her explanation was delivered with such genuine concern and maternal warmth that Wilson found himself nodding along, despite the obvious inconsistencies in her account. Meanwhile, Madison Clark had been recording the entire exchange, and her footage would later become crucial evidence in understanding what had actually transpired. Jake Peterson attempted to support Derek's version of events, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment. She's lying. She did something to Derek's shoulder, and then she made me crash into that cart. I don't know how she did it, but she definitely did something. Tyler Brooks nodded vigorously in agreement, though. His contribution to the discussion was somewhat undermined by his continued fixation on the trash can containing his phone. She's like some kind of ninja or something. None of us could even touch her, and we all ended up getting hurt or humiliated. Wilson studied the three young men with the analytical eye of someone who had interviewed countless witnesses to violent incidents. Their story had the emotional resonance of truth. They were genuinely upset and confused about what had happened to them, but the specific details didn't align with the physical evidence or the demeanor of the alleged perpetrator. Emma Martinez had remained silent throughout the initial exchange, but Wilson's attention eventually focused on her as the apparent catalyst for whatever had transpired. "Miss Martinez, can you tell me what you saw?" Emma's response was careful and measured, reflecting both her natural honesty and her awareness that her words might have significant consequences for someone who had protected her. Derek and his friends came over to my table and started saying things that made me uncomfortable. When I tried to leave, they surrounded me and started threatening me. Mrs. Rodriguez came over and asked them to return to their seats, but they got aggressive with her too. "Aggressive how?" Wilson pressed. Derek told her to mind her own business and get back to serving food. Jake was holding my lunch tray like he was going to dump it on me. Tyler was recording everything on his phone. When Mrs. Rodriguez asked them again to leave me alone, Derek stepped toward her and told her to make him stop. Wilson's expression hardened as he absorbed Emma's account. The behavior she described fit perfectly with complaints he had received about Derek's crew over the past several months, and it aligned with the kind of escalating bullying that he had been warning the administration needed to address before. "Someone got seriously hurt, and then what happened?" he asked. Emma's eyes flicked briefly toward Maria before returning to Wilson's face. "I'm not really sure. Everything happened very fast." Derek suddenly grabbed his shoulder and sat down. Jake somehow ran into that cart over there, and Tyler got tangled up in some chairs. Mrs. Rodriguez was just trying to stay out of their way the whole time. Her account was technically accurate, while being completely unhelpful in explaining the specific mechanics of how three athletic teenagers had simultaneously suffered mishaps while confronting a middle-aged cafeteria worker. Wilson sensed that Emma was protecting Maria, but he couldn't determine whether that protection was warranted or misguided. Madison Clark had been recording throughout the confrontation and its aftermath, and Wilson's attention turned to her as a potentially objective witness. "Miss Clark, I assume you have video of what happened." Madison's response was uncharacteristically hesitant, reflecting her growing uncertainty about what she had actually captured. "I have some footage, but it's kind of confusing. It looks like Derek and the guys just started having accidents when they tried to get close to her. May I see the video?" Madison handed over her phone with obvious reluctance, and Wilson spent several minutes reviewing the footage while the assembled students watched in tense silence. The video showed Derek approaching Maria aggressively, followed by his sudden collapse. It captured Jake's failed charge and subsequent crash into the serving line. It documented Tyler's entanglement in furniture, and the mysterious disappearance of his phone into the trash can. What the video didn't show was any clear evidence of Maria initiating contact with any of the students. Her movements appeared defensive and reactive, designed to avoid the aggressive actions of Derek's crew rather than to cause them harm. Yet the results spoke for themselves. 3 healthy young men had been effectively neutralized by someone who appeared to be doing nothing more than routine cafeteria maintenance. Wilson handed the phone back to Madison with a thoughtful expression that revealed nothing about his conclusions. His military experience had exposed him to elite operators whose combat skills were so refined that they could neutralize threats while maintaining plausible deniability about their actions. The techniques he had witnessed in special operations units often appeared accidental or coincidental to untrained observers. The problem was that Maria Rodriguez was supposed to be a cafeteria worker, not a covert operative with advanced combat training. Her employment records showed 3 years of steady service with no incidents, no complaints, and no indication that she possessed any unusual skills or background. Yet the evidence before him suggested capabilities that went far beyond anything a normal civilian should possess. Derek's condition was particularly puzzling. Wilson had seen enough combat injuries to recognize nerve damage when he encountered it, and Derek's symptoms suggested a precisely applied pressure point technique that temporarily disrupted nerve function. Such techniques were taught in advanced military training programs, but they weren't something that most people could execute without extensive practice and anatomical knowledge. "Derek, can you move your fingers?" Wilson asked. Derek attempted to flex his hand and winced as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his arm. "It's getting a little better, but it still feels like my whole arm is asleep. What did she do to me?" Wilson's response was carefully neutral, designed to gather information without revealing his own suspicions. Nerve compression can cause temporary numbness and pain. Sometimes it happens when you fall or twist your body in an unusual way. The explanation was medically plausible, but did nothing to address the underlying question of how Derek had ended up in a position to suffer such an injury. Maria had been standing several feet away when he collapsed, and no physical contact was visible on the security footage. Jake Peterson was becoming increasingly agitated as he realized that his account of events was being questioned rather than accepted at face value. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like we made this whole thing up. She attacked us, and now you're treating us like we're the criminals." Wilson's voice remained calm and professional despite Jake's rising anger. "I'm not treating anyone like a criminal. I'm trying to understand what happened so I can file an accurate report. Right now I have 3 students claiming they were assaulted by a cafeteria worker, but the physical evidence and witness statements don't clearly support that claim." Tyler Brooks had finally retrieved his phone from the trash can and was attempting to determine whether it was salvageable. The device was covered in a mixture of discarded food and liquid that made it both disgusting and non-functional, adding insult to the injury of his public humiliation. "My phone is completely destroyed," he announced, as if this fact alone proved Maria's guilt. She deliberately threw it in the trash. Maria's response was delivered with such convincing innocence that several students found themselves smiling despite the tension of the situation. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry about your phone. I was just trying to help you make your call to security, and my hand must have slipped. These old fingers don't work as well as they used to." The suggestion that Tyler's expensive smartphone had been destroyed through Maria's clumsiness rather than deliberate action was both insulting and impossible to disprove. Wilson found himself admiring the elegant simplicity of her approach, maintaining complete deniability while achieving tactical objectives that would have been the envy of any special operations unit. Principal Chun chose that moment to arrive. Having been summoned by reports of a significant disturbance in the cafeteria, his appearance added another layer of complexity to an already confusing situation. as he brought with him the institutional authority to make decisions about discipline and consequences. "Officer Wilson, what's the situation here?" Chun asked, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who dealt with teenage drama on a daily basis. Wilson's response was measured and diplomatic, reflecting his awareness that his conclusions would have significant implications for everyone involved. "We have reports of an altercation between some students and Mrs. Rodriguez. The students claim they were assaulted, but the evidence is inconsistent with their account." Chun's gaze moved between the disheveled students and the composed cafeteria worker, and his expression suggested that he was having difficulty reconciling the contrast between their respective conditions. "Mrs. Rodriguez, did you have any physical contact with these students?" Maria's response was delivered with the kind of earnest sincerity that made questioning her account seem almost cruel. "Principal Chun, I would never lay a hand on any student. When I saw Derek and his friends bothering Emma during her lunch, I simply asked them to return to their seats. They seemed to get upset about that and started having accidents while they were moving around. I tried to stay out of their way, but you know how energetic teenage boys can be." Her explanation painted Derek's crew as clumsy and aggressive while positioning herself as a concerned adult who had tried to protect a vulnerable student. The narrative was both believable and impossible to contradict without appearing to attack a conscientious employee who was simply doing her job. Derek made one final attempt to assert his version of events, his voice rising with frustration at the adult's apparent willingness to accept Maria's story over his own. "This is insane. She's lying. She did something to us, and everyone is just going to pretend it didn't happen." Wilson's response revealed the first hint of his growing suspicions about Maria's true capabilities. "Derek, sometimes in stressful situations, our perception of events can be affected by adrenaline and emotion. It's possible that what felt like an attack was actually a series of unfortunate accidents that occurred while you were focused on your confrontation with Miss Martinez." The suggestion that Derek's own aggressive behavior had somehow caused his injuries was the final straw for his already fragile composure. His face flushed with anger and humiliation as he realized that the adults in the room were not going to validate his account or provide him with the satisfaction of seeing Maria punished for his suffering. But Derek Harrison had not reached his position as the apex predator of Lincoln High School's social hierarchy by accepting defeat gracefully. If the official channels would not provide him with justice, he would find other ways to even the score. The aftermath of the cafeteria incident created ripples that spread far beyond Lincoln High School's institutional walls, carried by social media algorithms that transformed Madison Clark's confusing footage into viral content viewed by millions. The video defied easy categorization. It wasn't quite a fight, wasn't exactly bullying intervention, and certainly wasn't anything that viewers could readily explain using their normal understanding of how physical confrontations worked. Within hours of Madison posting the footage to her various social media accounts, the comment sections exploded with theories, analysis, and increasingly sophisticated attempts to understand what they were witnessing. Military veterans began identifying subtle movements and positioning that suggested professional training. Martial arts experts pointed out footwork and timing that indicated advanced combat skills. Even casual viewers sensed that something extraordinary had occurred, though they couldn't articulate exactly what made the footage so compelling. The video's viral spread caught the attention of communities that Maria Rodriguez had hoped would never notice her existence. In a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., analysts who specialized in identifying covert operatives flagged the footage for closer examination. Their facial recognition software, designed to penetrate false identities and locate missing persons, began comparing Maria's image against databases that officially didn't exist. Meanwhile, at Lincoln High School, the official response to the incident reflected the Kiko Institutional paralysis that occurred when established procedures proved inadequate. For unusual circumstances, Principal Chen found himself facing a situation where 3 popular students claimed assault by a staff member, but every piece of evidence suggested that the staff member had done nothing wrong. Derek Harrison's medical examination revealed nerve compression consistent with a fall or awkward movement, but no signs of external trauma that would indicate an attack. Jake Peterson's injuries were minor bruises and scrapes that matched his documented impact with cafeteria furniture. Tyler Brooks's only loss was his smartphone, which could easily be explained as an accident during the general chaos. The security footage, reviewed frame by both school administrators and Derek's increasingly frustrated father, showed Maria maintaining defensive positioning throughout the confrontation while Derek's crew appeared to injure themselves through their own aggressive actions. No clear evidence of assault could be identified, despite the obvious fact that 3 healthy young men had been effectively neutralized by a middle-aged woman. Richard Harrison's response to his son's humiliation was swift and characteristically overwhelming. Within 24 hours of the incident, he had deployed private investigators to conduct a comprehensive background check on Maria Rodriguez, retained lawyers to explore legal options against the school district, and begun applying political pressure on local officials to ensure that the matter received appropriate attention. What Richard Harrison didn't anticipate was that his investigation would uncover information that would threaten the foundation of his own carefully constructed empire. The private investigators he hired were competent professionals who specialized in employment verification and background research for corporate clients. Their standard procedures included criminal background checks, credit history analysis, employment verification, and immigration status confirmation. For most subjects, such research would reveal a complete picture of personal and professional history going back decades. Maria Rodriguez's background, however, presented unusual challenges from the very beginning. Her employment history prior to Lincoln High School was sparse and difficult to verify. Her listed previous employer, a small restaurant in Arizona, had closed permanently several years earlier, with no forwarding contact information for former management. Her educational credentials came from institutions that had undergone significant administrative changes, making verification of her claims nearly impossible. More troubling was the complete absence of any digital footprint prior to her arrival in Riverside 5 years earlier. In an age where everyone left electronic traces through social media, online purchases, digital subscriptions, and countless other interactions, Maria Rodriguez appeared to have materialized out of nowhere with no verifiable history beyond her current identity. The investigators' report landed on Richard Harrison's desk 48 hours after the cafeteria incident, and its contents triggered alarm bells that went far beyond his son's teenage drama. As someone who had built his fortune working with military and intelligence agencies, Harrison recognized the hallmarks of a constructed identity when he encountered them. Professional false identities, the kind used by intelligence operatives and protected witnesses, were specifically designed to pass casual scrutiny while concealing deeper truths. They included employment histories that were technically verifiable, but practically unreachable, educational credentials from institutions that had undergone convenient administrative changes, and carefully managed digital footprints that appeared normal without revealing anything substantial. Harrison's next phone call was to Marcus Blackwell, a former CIA operative who now ran security consulting for Harrison Defense Solutions. Blackwell's expertise in counterintelligence and personnel vetting had made him invaluable for identifying security threats and conducting deeper background investigations that required specialized knowledge and resources. "Marcus, I need you to run a priority investigation on someone," Harrison said without preamble. "Name is Maria Rodriguez, currently employed as cafeteria staff at Lincoln High School. Standard background check shows significant anomalies that Suggest a constructed identity. Blackwell's response reflected both professional curiosity and immediate concern. Constructed identities in suburban settings typically meant one of three things: federal witness protection, intelligence operatives working undercover, or fugitives with resources sufficient to purchase professional false documentation. What's the context? Blackwell asked. Corporate security issue? Harrison's explanation of the cafeteria incident only deepened Blackwell's interest. The behavior described Derek's crew's systematic neutralization by someone with no apparent training suggested capabilities that were inconsistent with Maria's supposed background. Combined with the identity anomalies, the pattern pointed toward someone with significant operational experience who was working very hard to remain invisible. "Give me 72 hours, Blackwell said. "If she's who I think she might be, we're going to need to be very careful about how we proceed." While Richard Harrison's investigation moved forward through private channels, a parallel inquiry was developing within military intelligence circles. The viral social media footage had been flagged by automated systems that monitored public networks for indicators of covert operatives, and analysts were beginning to piece together connections that had been buried for years. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, working from a classified facility in Virginia, was conducting her own review of the footage when facial recognition software identified a potential match with someone who was supposed to be dead. The match was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, a former SEAL Team 6 operative who had been reported killed in action during a classified operation in Syria 3 years earlier. The problem was that Sarah Mitchell's death had been a carefully constructed fiction, designed to protect her from retaliation while allowing her to disappear from military records. The operation that had supposedly killed her had actually been an extraction under fire, necessitated by her discovery of weapons trafficking that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon. Hayes immediately initiated a secure communication with Admiral Robert Kane, the Naval Special Warfare Commander who had authorized Mitchell's extraction and subsequent disappearance. Kane's response to the identification was immediate, and alarmed. He had spent 3 years believing that one of his most valuable operatives was safely hidden under a new identity, living quietly in a location known only to a handful of trusted personnel. The fact that Mitchell had been identified through social media footage meant that her cover was blown, her location was compromised, and the people she had been hiding from now knew exactly where to find her. Worse, the viral nature of the footage meant that her exposure was public and irreversible. Kane's next call was to Sarah Mitchell herself, using an emergency communication protocol that had been established for exactly this type of crisis. Number he dialed connected to a secured device that Maria Rodriguez kept hidden in her small apartment, a lifeline to her previous existence that she had hoped never to need. "Ghost, this is Admiral Kane. Your cover is blown. How soon can you be ready to move?" Maria's response came without hesitation, delivered in the crisp military tone that she had suppressed for 3 years. "Sir, I can be mobile in under 20 minutes. What's the threat assessment?" Facial recognition hit on the cafeteria footage. "The same people who forced your extraction are now aware of your location and identity. We have to assume they're already moving assets into position." Maria's mind raced through the implications of Kane's warning. The weapons trafficking network that she had exposed included not only Pentagon officials but private military contractors with resources that rivaled those of small nations. They had already demonstrated their willingness to kill American military personnel to protect their operations, and they would not hesitate to eliminate a witness who could expose their continued activities. "Sir, there are civilians here who could become collateral damage. Students and staff who have no connection to this situation." Kane's voice carried the weight of someone making decisions with incomplete information and no good options. "Understood, but your first priority has to be survival. These people have had 3 years to plan their response to your reappearance, and they won't make the same mistakes twice." As Maria ended the call, and began implementing the escape procedures that she had rehearsed mentally every day for 3 years. She realized that her carefully constructed quiet life was about to become the center of a conflict that had been building since her supposed death. The question was whether she could protect the innocent people around her while fighting a war that most of them didn't even know existed. Across town, Derek Harrison was experiencing his own awakening to the broader implications of his cafeteria humiliation. His father's phone calls had revealed that the lunch lady who had embarrassed him was apparently much more than she appeared. And Richard Harrison's increasing agitation suggested that the situation had implications far beyond teenage social dynamics. "Dad, what's going on?" Derek asked as he watched his father pace his home office while conducting increasingly urgent phone conversations. "It's just some crazy cafeteria lady who got lucky." Richard Harrison's response revealed the first hint of the larger conspiracy that was about to engulf them all. "Son, that woman isn't a cafeteria lady. She's someone who should have been dead for 3 years. And her reappearance means that some very dangerous people are about to pay very close attention to our family." Derek's confusion was genuine and complete. Nothing in his privileged teenage existence had prepared him for the possibility that his humiliation in the school cafeteria was connected to military conspiracies and covert operations. The idea that Maria Rodriguez was anything other than what she appeared to be seemed impossible to reconcile with his understanding of how the world worked. But as phone calls continued through the night and his father's security team began implementing protocols typically reserved for international travel in hostile territories, Derek began to understand that his attempt to bully a vulnerable student had somehow triggered events that were completely beyond his comprehension or control. The revelation that was about to transform Lincoln High School from a typical suburban institution into the center of a national security crisis was still hours away, but the pieces were already falling into place for a confrontation that would expose secrets buried at the highest levels of government and military leadership. Marcus Blackwell's investigation into Maria Rodriguez's background revealed layers of deception so sophisticated that they could only have been created by intelligence professionals with unlimited resources and complete access to government databases. Each document in her file was technically legitimate, but practically suspicious, creating the kind of paper trail that would satisfy casual scrutiny while concealing fundamental truths about her real identity and history. Working from his secure office in Harrison Defense Solutions corporate headquarters, Blackwell deployed the same investigative techniques that had made him invaluable during his CIA career. His approach was methodical and comprehensive, beginning with standard public record searches and escalating through increasingly classified databases that required special access and careful operational security. The first red flag emerged from immigration records that showed Maria Rodriguez entering the United States 5 years earlier with documentation that was flawless in every technical detail, but inconsistent with typical immigration patterns. Her visa application included employment verification from companies that existed in government databases but had no meaningful operational history, educational credentials from institutions that had undergone convenient administrative restructuring, and financial documentation that suggested resources without revealing their sources. Blackwell's experience in creating cover identities for CIA operatives allowed him to recognize the professional craftsmanship behind Maria's documentation. The quality of her false identity was so high that it suggested military or intelligence agency involvement, which meant that whoever she really was had connections at the highest levels of the national security establishment. His next investigative avenue focused on the specific details of Maria's supposed employment history, using resources that were unavailable to typical private investigators. The restaurant in Arizona where she claimed to have worked had indeed existed, but deeper research revealed that it had been purchased 6 months before her alleged employment by a shell company with connections to Pentagon procurement contracts. The shell company's ownership structure led through a maze of corporate entities and offshore registrations that were designed to conceal the ultimate source of funding. Blackwell's analysis revealed patterns consistent with the kind of financial networks used to support classified operations, suggesting that Maria's background had been constructed by professionals with access to unlimited resources and sophisticated money laundering capabilities. While Blackwell pursued financial and documentation trails, parallel investigations were developing within government agencies that had been alerted to Maria's exposure through automated monitoring systems. The Department of Defense's Counterintelligence Division had flagged the viral social media footage for analysis, and their conclusions were sending shockwaves through the national security establishment. Colonel Patricia Hayes had spent her career identifying and protecting military personnel whose identities needed to remain classified for operational security reasons. Her review of the cafeteria footage revealed tactical movements and combat techniques that were consistent with Navy SEAL training, specifically the kind of advanced close-quarters combat skills taught only to Tier 1 operators. The facial recognition match with Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had been confirmed through multiple biometric analysis programs, each one returning probability scores that exceeded the threshold for positive identification. The problem was that Sarah Mitchell was officially dead, killed in action during a classified operation that had never been publicly acknowledged. Hayes's investigation into Mitchell's service record revealed a career that read like a recruitment poster for elite military units. Graduated top of her class from the Naval Academy. Selected for SEAL training despite the program's exclusion of women at the time. Assigned to increasingly classified operations that demonstrated exceptional tactical abilities and leadership under pressure. Her final assignment had been to a joint task force investigating weapons trafficking in the Middle East, where American-made military equipment was being sold to insurgent groups and used against American forces. Mitchell's team had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption involving Pentagon officials, defense contractors, and foreign intermediaries who were profiting from weapons sales that were directly contributing to American casualties. The operation that supposedly killed Mitchell had actually been an emergency extraction necessitated by her discovery of evidence that implicated officials at the highest levels of the defense establishment. Her death had been faked to protect her from retaliation while allowing military investigators to pursue the weapons trafficking network without alerting its participants to the scope of the investigation. Hayes's secure communication with Admiral Kane confirmed that Mitchell had been living under the Rodriguez identity as part of a witness protection program administered by Naval Special Warfare Command. Her location had been kept secret even from most military personnel involved in the original investigation, known only to a small circle of trusted officials who had oversight responsibility for her safety. The fact that Mitchell's location had been compromised through viral social media footage meant that the same people who had tried to kill her 3 years earlier now knew exactly where to find her. Worse, the public nature of her exposure meant that any attempt to relocate her would be complicated by media attention and public curiosity about her true identity. Kane's assessment of the threat level was immediate and severe. The weapons trafficking network that Mitchell had exposed included not only Pentagon officials but private military contractors with international reach and resources that rivaled those of sovereign nations. Harrison Defense Solutions was one of several companies that had profited enormously from the weapons sales, and Richard Harrison personally had been identified as a key figure in organizing and financing the trafficking operations. The irony that Mitchell was now living in the same community as one of her primary targets was not lost on the military investigators, who were scrambling to develop response plans. Harrison's investigation into Maria Rodriguez's background was actually an attempt to identify the woman who possessed evidence that could destroy his business empire and send him to prison for treason. Meanwhile, at Lincoln High School, the Consequences of Derek's cafeteria humiliation were rippling outward in ways that no one could have anticipated. The viral footage had attracted attention from local news organizations, national media outlets, and social media influencers who were fascinated by the story of an ordinary cafeteria worker who had somehow neutralized three aggressive teenagers without apparent effort. Emma Martinez found herself at the center of unwanted attention as reporters and social media personalities sought interviews about her experience with both Derek's bullying and Maria's intervention. Her quiet academic life was being transformed into a public spectacle that threatened to overshadow her educational goals and family privacy. The media attention also attracted the notice of advocacy groups focused on school bullying prevention, who saw Emma's story as a perfect example of how institutional failures to address systematic harassment could escalate into dangerous confrontations. Their involvement added another layer of pressure on school administrators who were already struggling to manage the situation's legal and public relations implications. Principal Chun's attempts to minimize the incident's impact were being undermined by the continuing viral spread of Madison's footage and the growing media interest in the story. His standard procedures for handling student conflicts were completely inadequate for managing a situation that involved potential federal law enforcement interest and national security implications. Officer Wilson's investigation had reached conclusions that he was reluctant to document in official reports. His military experience allowed him to recognize the tactical sophistication behind Maria's actions, but his position as a school security guard limited his access to the resources necessary to pursue deeper investigation. Wilson's attempts to research Maria's background through standard law enforcement databases had yielded the same frustrating mixture of technical legitimacy and practical emptiness that other investigators were encountering. Her documentation was perfect in every detail, but revealed nothing substantial about her real identity or capabilities. More troubling was Wilson's growing certainty that Maria Rodriguez possessed combat training that exceeded anything available to civilian populations. The specific techniques he had witnessed in the cafeteria footage were consistent with special operations training, but the official narrative required him to accept that a cafeteria worker had somehow acquired such skills through normal life experiences. As the investigation expanded to include federal agencies with resources and authorities far beyond those available to local officials, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose not only Maria's true identity, but the larger conspiracy that had forced her into hiding 3 years earlier. The question was whether that confrontation would result in justice for the military personnel who had died because of weapons trafficking, or whether the same forces that had tried to eliminate Sarah Mitchell would succeed in their second attempt. Now that they knew exactly where to find her, Richard Harrison's private office had been transformed into a command center that would have impressed Pentagon officials with its sophisticated communication equipment and real-time intelligence gathering capabilities. Multiple screens displayed updates from various investigative efforts. Secure phones maintained contact with military contractors and government officials, and encrypted computers processed information that was arriving from sources around the world. The investigation into Maria Rodriguez had evolved far beyond simple employee background verification into something approaching a military intelligence operation. Harrison's resources, accumulated through decades of defense contracting work, included access to databases and analytical capabilities that rivaled those of government agencies, and he was deploying all of them to understand the threat that the cafeteria worker represented to his business empire. Marcus Blackwell's latest briefing had revealed connections that sent chills through Harrison's normally composed demeanor. The financial analysis of Maria's constructed identity had uncovered links to the same Pentagon officials and defense contractors who had been investigated for weapons trafficking 3 years earlier, suggesting that she was not simply someone with a mysterious past, but someone with specific knowledge of their activities. She's not just hiding from someone, Blackwell reported during their secured video conference. She's hiding because of something she knows. The sophistication of her cover identity suggests she was a principal witness to something significant, enough to warrant this level of protection. Harrison's response reflected his growing awareness that his son's cafeteria humiliation had somehow connected their family to a much larger and more dangerous situation. What kind of witness protection requires this level of operational security? Blackwell's analysis was thorough and chilling in its implications. The kind that protects someone who can testify about activities that would result in treason charges for everyone involved. The financial network supporting her identity traced back to classified Pentagon programs that officially don't exist. While Harrison absorbed the implications of Blackwell's investigation, parallel developments were unfolding within the military intelligence community that would soon bring the situation to a crisis point. Admiral Kane's emergency protocols had been activated to protect Sarah Mitchell, but the resources available for her extraction were limited by the need to maintain operational security and avoid attracting additional attention to her location. The challenge was that Mitchell's exposure had occurred in the most public possible manner, with viral social media footage that was being analyzed by intelligence services around the world. Any attempt to relocate her would now be conducted under intense scrutiny from media outlets, social media influencers, and potentially hostile intelligence services that might exploit the situation for their own purposes. Kane's secure communication with Mitchell had revealed her assessment of the local threat environment and her recommendations for managing the crisis. Her years of living in Riverside had given her detailed knowledge of the community's resources, escape routes, and potential safehouses, but they had also created emotional connections that complicated her extraction options. "Sir, there are students at the school who will become targets if these people believe they have information about my identity," Mitchell reported during their encrypted conversation. Emma Martinez has already received media attention that could make her a liability in their assessment. Kane's response reflected the difficult balance between protecting a valuable intelligence asset and minimizing collateral damage to innocent civilians. "Ghost, our primary responsibility is your survival. These people have already demonstrated their willingness to kill American military personnel to protect their operations." Mitchell's argument revealed both her tactical expertise and her personal evolution during 3 years of civilian life. "Sir, if we abandon these civilians to protect my extraction, we're essentially doing the same thing that the weapons traffickers did when they prioritized profits over American lives." The philosophical debate about military ethics and civilian protection was interrupted by urgent intelligence updates that transformed the situation from a potential threat into an immediate crisis. NSA monitoring systems had detected communications between Harrison Defense Solutions and overseas military contractors that suggested coordinated planning for a direct action operation in Riverside. The communications traffic indicated that Harrison was not simply investigating Maria's identity, but was actively coordinating with resources that included former special operations personnel who specialized in eliminating problems that conventional legal procedures couldn't address. The implied threat was clear. If official channels couldn't neutralize the witness who threatened their operations, they would use unofficial methods to achieve the same result. Kane's immediate response was to activate emergency protocols that would deploy federal resources to protect Mitchell, while simultaneously launching a broader investigation into the weapons trafficking network that had forced her into hiding. The challenge was that such an operation would necessarily involve multiple federal agencies, whose own personnel might include individuals connected to the conspiracy. At Lincoln High School, the consequences of Mitchell's exposure were beginning to manifest in ways that confirmed her worst fears about civilian casualties. Emma Martinez had received threatening phone calls from unknown numbers. Her mother's workplace had been contacted by people claiming to be investigating her family's immigration status, and their apartment building had been visited by individuals who claimed to be conducting routine security assessments. The escalating pressure on Emma's family demonstrated the weapons traffickers' willingness to target innocent civilians as leverage against Mitchell, confirming that the moral stakes of the situation extended far beyond the original military conspiracy. Emma's mother, working double shifts to support their small family, was now living in fear that her daughter's involvement in the cafeteria incident had somehow made them targets of forces they couldn't understand or resist. Officer Wilson's investigation had reached similar conclusions about the broader implications of the situation. His attempts to coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies had revealed that multiple agencies were conducting parallel investigations into the same individuals and organizations, suggesting a conspiracy whose scope exceeded anything that local authorities could address independently. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lincoln High School's parking lot as Maria Rodriguez arrived for what she knew would be her final day serving lunch to students who had no idea they were about to witness the collision of two worlds. Her worn pickup truck looked even more out of place among the collection of expensive vehicles that had appeared overnight. Black SUVs with tinted windows and government plates that suggested the arrival of federal agents who were preparing for something far more significant than a typical school day. Maria's trained eye cataloged the tactical positioning of the vehicles, noting sight lines, escape routes, and the telltale signs of surveillance equipment that transformed the familiar school grounds into a potential battlefield. The presence of federal resources meant that Admiral Kane had deployed protection assets, but it also meant that Richard Harrison's private military contractors were likely already in position to counter any official intervention. Inside the school, the atmosphere crackled with tension that even the most oblivious students could sense. Principal Chen had arrived early to find federal agents requesting access to security footage, school personnel files, and detailed building schematics that suggested they were preparing for some kind of emergency response. His attempts to understand the scope of the situation had been met with polite but firm instructions to maintain normal operations while allowing the agents to establish their security perimeter. Emma Martinez walked through the hallways with the hyper-aware alertness of someone who had spent the weekend learning that her simple act of standing up to bullies had somehow triggered events that threatened her family's safety. The threatening phone calls had continued through the weekend, escalating from vague warnings about staying quiet to specific threats against her mother's employment and their housing situation. Derek Harrison's arrival at school was accompanied by a security detail that would have been appropriate for a visiting foreign dignitary, reflecting his father's growing paranoia about the implications of Maria's true identity. The three black SUVs that delivered him to the main entrance carried former special operations personnel whose presence sent clear signals about the Harrison family's willingness to use private military resources to protect their interests. The cafeteria preparation that morning followed Maria's usual routine with deadly precision, but her movements now carried the purposeful efficiency of someone preparing for combat rather than lunch service. Her positioning behind the serving counter provided optimal sightlines to all entrances, while keeping her within reach of the improvised weapons that her colleagues still believed were simply kitchen equipment. Mrs. Patricia Williams and Carlos Mendez noticed the unusual tension in their normally calm colleague, but they attributed her focused intensity to stress from the previous week's incident and the media attention that continued to swirl around the school. They had no way of knowing that Maria was conducting final equipment checks and mental rehearsals for scenarios that could involve protecting hundreds of students from violence that would make Derek's bullying seem trivial by comparison. Officer Wilson's morning security briefing had included federal agents, whose presence confirmed his worst suspicions about the true scope of the situation. The agents' questions about building layout, student population patterns, and emergency evacuation procedures made clear that they were preparing for a significant security incident that could involve weapons and violence. The first indication that the day would be anything but normal came at 10:30, when Madison Clark's social media monitoring detected unusual activity on her various platforms. The cafeteria footage that had made her briefly famous was being shared by accounts with no previous connection to Lincoln High School, accompanied by comments and analysis that suggested professional rather than casual interest in the content. The comments included detailed tactical analysis of Maria's movements, speculation about her military background, and increasingly specific questions about her identity and current location. Madison's excitement about her viral fame began to transform into concern as she realized that her footage had attracted attention from people who were clearly not ordinary social media users. At 11:15, as the first lunch period began with apparent normalcy, federal agents positioned throughout the school received alerts that changed everything. NSHA's surveillance systems had detected communications indicating that Harrison Defense Solutions' private military assets were moving into final positions around Lincoln High School, preparing for an operation designed to eliminate the witness who threatened their weapons trafficking network. Maria sensed the shift in tactical situation before any official warnings reached her location. Her years of combat experience had taught her to read environmental changes that indicated impending violence, and everything about the morning's energy suggested that multiple hostile forces were converging on her position with lethal intent. Emma Martinez entered the cafeteria at her usual time, carrying her books and wearing the determined expression of someone who had decided that normal routine was the best response to abnormal circumstances. Her mother had wanted to keep her home from school, but Emma had insisted that hiding would only confirm that their family could be intimidated by threats they didn't understand. Derek Harrison's entrance was delayed by security protocols that his father's team had implemented to protect him from potential collateral damage. But when he finally appeared, his demeanor showed none of his usual arrogant confidence. The weekend's revelations about Maria's true identity had shaken his understanding of power dynamics and left him uncertain about his role in events that clearly exceeded his comprehension. The first direct confrontation began not with violence, but with the arrival of Marcus Blackwell, whose appearance in the cafeteria wearing tactical gear and accompanied by 4 armed contractors sent immediate shockwaves through the assembled students. His approach to the serving line was deliberately theatrical, designed to force Maria into a position where her response would reveal her true capabilities to everyone present. "Sarah Mitchell," Blackwell called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent cafeteria. Also known as Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, also known as GHOST, tactical callsign for operations that officially never happened. The use of her real name and military designation hit Maria like a physical blow, shattering the carefully constructed identity that had protected her for 3 years. Students throughout the cafeteria pulled out phones to record what was clearly developing into a confrontation that would dwarf the previous week's incident in significance and drama. Maria's response was delivered in the calm, professional tone that she had used when reporting to superior officers during her active duty career. "I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is Maria Rodriguez, and I work in food service." Blackwell's laugh was harsh and without humor, the sound of someone who had finally cornered a long-sought target. The voice analysis confirms identity match, the facial recognition is definitive, and the tactical movement patterns from last week's footage are consistent with SEAL Team 6 training protocols. There's no point in maintaining the charade. The revelation that their quiet cafeteria worker was actually an elite military operative sent shockwaves through the assembled students and staff. Emma Martinez stared in amazement at the woman who had protected her, suddenly understanding that her intervention had been far more significant than a simple adult stopping teenage bullying. Derek Harrison's reaction was more complex, mixing vindication at having his suspicions confirmed with growing terror at the realization that his family was somehow connected to military conspiracies and covert operations that could result in violence within his school. Federal agents positioned throughout the building received authorization to move into active protection mode, but their response was complicated by the presence of students and staff who could become collateral casualties if the situation escalated to open conflict. The challenge was protecting Mitchell while minimizing harm to innocent civilians who had no connection to the weapons trafficking investigation. Blackwell's next words revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had forced Mitchell into hiding and confirmed her worst fears about the reach of the weapons trafficking network. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell possesses evidence of weapons sales that resulted in the deaths of American military personnel. That evidence threatens national security interests and must be contained. The euphemistic language concealed the deadly reality that Blackwell and his team were prepared to commit murder in a high school cafeteria to protect the profits and freedom of defense contractors who had betrayed their own country for financial gain. Their willingness to conduct such an operation in front of hundreds of witnesses demonstrated both their desperation and their confidence in their ability to control the narrative afterward. Maria's assessment of the tactical situation was immediate and professional. Blackwell's team had positioned themselves to control the cafeteria's main exits while maintaining fields of fire that would allow them to eliminate her, while claiming that she had initiated hostilities. The presence of students throughout the dining area meant that any defensive action she took would risk innocent casualties. "What exactly do you want?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the knowledge that she was facing opponents who had every advantage except moral justification for their actions. Blackwell's response revealed the cold calculation behind the operation. "We want the evidence files that you removed from the Syrian operation. We want confirmation that you haven't shared that information with unauthorized personnel. And we want assurance that you understand the consequences of any future attempts to surface that material." The demand was essentially a death sentence disguised as negotiation, since Maria's evidence was the only thing that had kept her alive for 3 years. Surrendering it would eliminate her value as a witness while confirming her location for future elimination operations. Emma Martinez, still seated at her usual table near the windows, found herself at the center of a confrontation that transformed her understanding of courage, justice, and the price of standing up for moral principles. The woman who had protected her from teenage bullies was now facing threats that could result in her death, and Emma realized that her own response would determine whether she was worthy of the protection she had received. Officer Wilson's position near the cafeteria entrance gave him clear sightlines to Blackwell's team and optimal positioning for defensive action, but his security guard role provided no legal authority for engaging armed contractors who had not yet committed any clearly illegal acts. His military training screamed warnings about the developing situation, but his civilian position limited his response options. The standoff stretched across seconds that felt like hours, with hundreds of students and staff members sensing that they were witnessing something historic and dangerous without understanding the full scope of what was unfolding before them. Social media live streams carried the confrontation to millions of viewers worldwide, ensuring that whatever happened next would become part of the permanent record. Maria's decision about how to respond would determine not only her own survival, but the fate of the evidence that could expose a weapons trafficking network responsible for American military deaths and the future safety of students who had committed no crime beyond being present when her past collided with her present. The moment of truth had arrived, and Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell was about to discover whether 3 years of hiding had been preparation for this final confrontation, or simply a delay before an inevitable reckoning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.